Letting Mexico Mellow You Out. This week's presentation by Sandy Britton. When you travel to, do business with, or move to another country, the culture clash can puzzle and even frustrate you, or it can expand your mind and change the way you see things. Sandy will share with us how the concept of cultural intelligence helped her understand her adopted country better. But even more important, how her time in Mexico has altered her view of life. Sandy is from Northern California. Her background is in software development and dog training. But she combines her love of cultural sociology and public speaking to bring us this presentation. Please welcome Sandy. Buenos dias. Can everybody hear me? And hopefully the mic won't pick up the sound of my stomach growling because I was too nervous to eat this morning. Okay, looking back on my childhood, I remember lots of individual incidents where my perception of the universe suddenly took a shift. For instance, when I found out the sun was actually 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth, and that all those little points up in the sky were suns of their own. Or when I discovered that if a cloud fell to the ground, it would be a nice fluffy piece of cotton ball that I could play on. It would be cold, damp, miserable fog. That was a big disappointment. The one that's relevant, the memory that's relevant to this talk, is when I was in maybe 4th grade, so about 9 years old, and we were watching a movie on one of those rickety old school projectors, and I remember just 2 scenes from that movie, and it must have been about cultural differences. In the first one, there was an American family, and they're eating, and the little boy starts to eat with his fingers, and the mother says, "What are you doing? You don't know, your fingers can have germs all over them. Eat with your knife and fork, you know they're clean." The next one showed a family, maybe Moroccan, sitting on the floor around a table, and the little boy, everybody's eating with their fingers, the little boy pulls out a knife and fork, and the mother says, "What are you doing? You don't know where those things have been. Eat with your fingers. You know they're clean." Okay, and I remember this little ping in my brain of suddenly realizing that practices in other cultures that may seem a little odd to me or maybe even wrong made perfect sense to the people in that culture in the context of that culture. So that was really my first inkling of the idea of cultural intelligence, this idea of understanding the underlying basis of other cultures. So I continue to be very fascinated with other cultures. I did a lot of reading on social and cultural anthropology. I took some courses in it. And I found over time that the most interesting and most dramatic cultural differences aren't readily visible. So if you can picture an iceberg, the part above the water is the part that we can all see, the difference in language, the difference in clothing, in traditions, and things like that. But under the water, there's this whole bigger layer of what I'll call cultural values, okay? And I'm going to define it as the almost unconscious assumptions we make about how the world is and how life should be lived that we absorb from our culture without even realizing it from the time we're born. Okay, and those are the differences that really cause cultural conflicts. It's not the visible ones, it's the invisible ones. And as businesses become more international, they become very aware of this, and they give courses now to their people who are going to do international trading on cultural differences so they can deal with it. But the rest of us are kind of on our own. We don't get that training. So when my husband and I were thinking about moving to Mexico, one of the big attractions for me was the idea of being able to immerse myself in another culture, really learn about another culture. And since we've been here, we've really made an effort to do so. We've learned the language, we bought a house on a village street, and we happily got adopted by a really lovely neighbor family that invites us to all their celebrations, and we invite them to ours. So I've had lots of exposure to the culture. But I still realized there were a lot of things I wasn't really understanding, wasn't really getting. And sometimes I worried about offending people, sometimes I didn't get a joke, that type of thing. And so I started consulting resources on Mexican culture, and I read a lot of things, but the most enlightening that I encountered was an audio course. And it was part of the great courses, which are like university courses that are recorded on audio. And the one that I listened to was called Customs of the World, using cultural intelligence to adapt wherever you are. And the lecturer was Professor David Livermore. He defines cultural intelligence as understanding how the other culture's underlying values and invisible assumptions are different from yours. So really making an effort to understand those differences. And that doesn't mean you have to like them, but if you want to adapt to another culture, you have to accept them. Because let's face it, you're not going to change them. And if you keep trying to resist them, it's just going to cause frustration, right? So the course addressed cultural differences all over the world. He divides them into 10 very broad cultural clusters. He divides the world into 10 cultural clusters. But obviously the greatest interest for me living here was the comparison of the Anglo cultures, which includes the English-speaking countries, basically, that came from England. So England itself, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And I would wager that most of the people here are in that cluster. And the other one was the Latin American cultural cluster that I was interested in, which includes South America, Central America, and Mexico. So I'm listening to this course, very entertaining. I highly recommend it. It's one of the highest rated courses on the great courses. And I not only had a lot of aha moments, now I understand that better, but I felt my attitude shifting as I thought back on experiences I had and I was able to reinterpret them in the light of the new information. And I was so enthusiastic about it, I was thinking, God, this would make a great talk for Open Circle. So here I am. Okay, now before I go into the details, I want to put out a couple of disclaimers. The first is that I'm not putting myself out as any kind of expert on this. You may listen to things I say and not agree with them, that's fine. In fact, if you want to discuss that in the discussion period at the end and share some of your own experiences, that's great. What I'm doing is sharing what this professor of social anthropology said about different cultures, and then relating that back to my own experience. And the next disclaimer is that I'm aware that my experience here is pretty limited. We've been here 3.5 years. Like I said, we've immersed ourselves as much as possible. But I'm very aware that most of my experience has been in a small town. And I know that's different from the big city. Okay? And the last thing is that it's always a bit difficult talking about culture and cultural norms or cultural values because it can sound like stereotyping. And I want to make it very clear I'm not trying to stereotype anybody. So if I say Anglo cultures are like this or Mexican cultures like that, I am not in any way saying that all the people in that culture are like that or believe that. Okay? Cultures vary. They vary by region, they vary by ethnic subgroup, they vary by religion. Families have their own cultures, and individuals have their own culture. So there's a lot of variance. So I'm just referring to these broad cultural norms, these broad cultural clusters, and I'm not claiming in any way that everybody in that culture feels or acts the same way. Okay? Now the course compared these 10 cultural clusters across 10 what he called cultural dimensions. And I'm going to address the 7 of those I found the most relevant to living in Mexico. What's a cultural dimension? It's a category of cultural values. And rather than try to explain what it is, I'm just going to dive in and start talking about the cultural dimensions as they relate to the Anglo cultures and the Mexican culture. So the first cultural dimension I'm going to talk about is identity. And identity in these cultural clusters is rated on a scale from being extremely individualistic to being extremely collectivistic. Okay, so I think we can all assume that Anglo cultures are very individualistic. I think the United States culture is one of the most individualistic in the world, in that people identify to themselves. Okay, Mexico is much more collective, and the collectivism is centered around the family. And I don't think that comes as a surprise to anybody. You just walk out on the Malecon and see the huge groups of people having picnics and parties. You go to Guadalajara and see everybody touring downtown. There's in big groups, they're big family groups. Of course, we in the Anglo cultures, we love our families, but the way we raise our children is very different. We raise them to be independent. We assume they're going to fly the nest and seek their own success. And we pretty much assume that they're going to be peer-oriented. That most of the things they do socially are going to be with their friends, with their peers. Okay? In Mexico, it's very different. They raise their kids to stay very attached to and feel a responsibility towards their families. And so that's their identity derives from the family. Okay? And not just the nuclear family, but the extended family. They're very aware of how they're relating to each other. And living in this town, talking to people, I can't tell you how many times I've said to somebody, do you know so-and-so? Oh yeah, that's my nephew, that's my uncle, that's, they're related in some way. I found it really fascinating. I had a couple of teenagers in the house I was doing an English class with, and the neighbor kid showed up. I came to water my plants, and he went out watering the plants, and he left. And I asked him, do you know him? Because I know they went to the same school. And one of the girls thinks about him for a minute, and she says, I think our grandfathers were cousins. Okay, so I'm thinking, without looking at Ancestry.com, I got no idea who my grandparents' cousins are. And I certainly don't know who the offspring of my grandparents' cousins are. But she was keeping that pattern in her brain of how she was related to all these different people. And that makes a lot of sense, the difference in the two cultures when you look back on their history. So in Mexico, you have an indigenous culture that was invaded by Europeans. The Europeans interbred with the indigenous cultures. The indigenous cultures lived under this foreign rule for a long time until they finally ejected the foreigners. And in order to survive, they kind of had to cluster together and with people they could trust. And who can you trust better than your kin? Okay, and so, that may be one of the reasons that it's so close-knit. Whereas in Anglo-cultures, it was just the opposite. So the Europeans invaded, let's say, the United States, but most of the Anglos, Canada, Australia, etc., are pretty similar. And they marginalized or wiped out the indigenous cultures. They basically took over the country. And then that was further augmented by immigration, sometimes from all over the world. And so these people are the people who are the most willing to leave their families. We're kind of self-selected for the really independent people who are most willing to leave their families and come seek their fortune elsewhere. And of course we all know that, yes, Mexicans do leave the country, they go up north, but for a lot of them it's not to seek their own success, it's to send money back to their families. And a lot of them come back as soon as they can. I don't know if you know, in the 9-day festival of San Andres that they have here, one of the days is dedicated to the hijos ausentes, the absent sons and daughters, that people are hoping will still come home. And a lot of them come to visit during that time. Okay, but one of the big differences in the way that we look at and raise our children was really brought home to me. I was doing an English lesson with a different student, a 20-year-old, and we were working on a paragraph in a sample test. And this paragraph had a bunch of scrambled sentences, and she was supposed to put them back in order. And the subject of the paragraph was kids leaving home to go to university and how thrilled they are at that first taste of independence, of being out from under parental rule, and how they get to dress how they want and manage their time how they want, but how a lot of them also have trouble with it. They have trouble buckling down and studying and stuff without the parents watching them. And she was really having trouble with this paragraph. And so in talking to her, I finally realized that the problem was not the English, the problem was the whole concept. Really? Kids want to leave? Because she very much wants to go to university because she sees the opportunity, but the one thing she really dreads is leaving her family. And this is just to move to Guadalajara. And she isn't just afraid to leave her mom because of her dependence on her mom, but because her mom is dependent on her. She's an active contributor to the family. She takes care of her little brother so her mom can work. And it was really worrying her. So I took out my phone and went on Facebook and showed her my niece, my 18-year-old niece, who starting at University of Washington, much further from her parents in Spokane than Guadalajara is from here, and how she actually wanted to stay the summer in Seattle rather than go back home to her family and stay with the sorority. And I think she was just really surprised, maybe even shocked, that an 18-year-old would be so eager to fly the nest. I found that really fascinating. And for us, that's more normal, especially in our generation. Leaving home at 18, 20, that was completely normal. I think they're staying a little longer now, maybe just because of the economy. Okay, so when I look at this, when I look at the family in Mexico, I definitely love my family, but I'm a very independent person. I was raised that way, and that's my personality. I value my independence. And I have to assume that most of you guys are the same. Because after all, we left our families behind to come here, right? And I have to admit, I think a few of the Mexicans here I've talked to have been a little appalled that I left a 20-year-old son to fend for himself when I came down here. He lived in a condo that we owned, but everything else was his responsibility. Earn his own money and pay his own bills. He's 24 now, he's doing fine. He's very independent, and I value that in him, okay? But looking around, I can definitely see the value of the family orientation. I see young families trying to raise kids who are getting plenty of help. They're getting help with babysitting. They're getting, they're getting help with everything. The poor mother is not alone in her house all day waiting for, dad to come home if she's a stay-at-home mom to begin with. The kids are very secure. They know that if anything happens to their parents, they're taken care of, and they know their relatives. The family is the safety net. And one thing that's always struck me here is you rarely see homeless people. Despite the very low standard of living in some of the areas around here, you don't see them. The last time we went back to visit North, and I've gotten used to them. When I lived there, I was struck all over again by the large number of homeless people. They used to live by a park, and when I walked to work in the mornings, I lived very close to work, under every picnic table was homeless people camping out. And I've gotten unused to seeing that now living in Mexico, so I think that's great. Okay, the second cultural dimension is authority, and that's ranked on a scale of high to low power distance. In other words, how hierarchical is the culture versus how egalitarian is it? And Latin American cultures are rated quite a bit more hierarchical than Anglo cultures that are much more egalitarian. And we can kind of see this as encoded in the Spanish language and the use of tú versus usted, the informal. But I also have to say that there's lots of languages that have that distinction. And for me, it's always been one of my biggest problems with speaking Spanish is trying to figure out when to use what. Because to me, using usted feels a little off-putting, like not friendly enough. But then I worry is using tú to overly friendly, overly familiar, or maybe even condescending. Still struggling with that. And I know that this hierarchical structure is flattening with subsequent generations in Mexico. So I have neighbors who are older than me who still, after almost 3 years of living on that street, call me Senora. They won't call me by my name, and they address me as usted. The kids call me Sandy. Okay? They still address me as usted also. It's only my peer group that addresses me as tú. And I find that very interesting. Now, I had a couple of incidents where I really noticed the difference in the authority. If you've ever been involved in a program here where you were kind of in charge, I work with the sewing program in Tepewa, and I'm one of the maestras. And this incident's funny looking back, but at the time I didn't find it so funny. We were going to throw the women a party to celebrate their success. And I had the address of where the party was going to be. I go and pick a bunch of them up to take there. I've got my GPS all programmed, and I head out. And as I'm heading out, I'm hearing them kind of talking to each other in the back seat. But with the engine noise, I'm concentrating on driving, I couldn't follow the Spanish, okay? And as I'm going along, it gets a little more heated. One of them receives a phone call. They talk on the phone for a little while. They talk among themselves again for a little while. And finally, I had to ask them, okay, what's going on? And it turned out they had let me drive for 20 minutes in the wrong direction. Because nobody wanted to tell the maestra that she was going the wrong way. Okay? So I think they'd hoped I would pick up on it. That I was listening to them and would pick up on it. But I couldn't understand what they were saying. So we turned around, but on the other hand, none of them were upset that they were 40 minutes late to the party. Like, what stuff happens. Okay, and the other one is working with my plumber. I told him I wanted a on-demand water heater, and so he immediately starts researching for me. Love the guy. What the different kinds of on-demand water heaters so that I could look up a little more on them. And I'm kind of waiting for him to give me his expert feedback on, is this a good choice or not? And I finally realized if I wanted him to do that, I was going to have to ask him. What do you think about on-demand water heaters? Because once I had asked for it, he was not going to counter-suggest unless I specifically asked him. Whereas in the United States, I think that, the guy would be, those are horrible or whatever, or I love those or whatever. Okay? So that's authority. The third one I'm going to talk about is achievement. And that's rated on a scale from competitive to cooperative. So I think you know where the United States sits in that, and probably most Anglo culture is very competitive. The competitive orientation emphasizes assertive behavior, achievement, and competition. Okay? The cooperative orientation emphasizes nurturing behavior, the quality of relationships, and cooperating to accomplish tasks. And that's the Mexican and Latin American cultures are far more on the cooperative end of things. Now, that doesn't mean they aren't competitive in things like sports and games and contests. They are. But in just terms of day-to-day life, getting stuff done, human transactions, they're much more cooperative. If you look at the Anglo cultures, you can see it in our language. We talk about the rat race. We talk about getting ahead. These competitive images. Latin cultures seem to be much more, we're all in this together. I just think about that when I'm in a store or a restaurant and the kids come in to sell the string beans and the restaurant is perfectly okay with them doing that, just to feel like everybody's got to earn a living. The novenario, where the neighborhood gathers together for 9 days to help pray souls to heaven. You know, that everybody's helping. The tradition of the kermes, the parties they have to raise money when people have medical problems. And they don't even have to say, here's why, well, they'll usually give the reason, but everybody knows that if it's a kermes, it's to raise money. It's a tradition to do that, for the community to get together and do that. And again, some of that may come from the differences between gathering together to survive a foreign invader versus striking out in search of fortune, like in the Anglo cultures. Okay, so, and when it comes to doing business, I've never done business here in terms of, being a trading partner with somebody. But in the U.S. we say, it's not personal, it's just business. But here, business is personal. Okay? They want to get to know their trading partners. And for a lot of Anglos, this is very frustrating. Why do we have to sit here and make small talk? Let's just get to the deal. They're not, in the Latin cultures, they're not seeing that as small talk. It's all part of the business transaction process. I want to get to know you, I want to make sure I can trust you, I want to make sure that everything we do is for the benefit of both parties. Okay, and I think to a certain extent in coming here, we've adopted this on a very small scale. I know that when I enter stores now, I always say, buenos dias, ¿cómo está? To the clerks behind the counters. We tend to develop close relationships with our housekeepers, our gardeners, our plumbers, our handymen, the other people who work for us. Whereas in the United States, it was just kind of a business transaction. You pay them and they'd head out. Another experience I've had here that kind of relates to this competition versus cooperation is going to Telcel. I had a pay-as-you-go plan. I had it on auto recharge, so that every time it dropped below a certain amount, it would automatically charge to my credit card to give me the next 100 minutes or whatever it was. And one day it went crazy and it auto charged like every 20 minutes. And I went in my computer and noticed this, my account being hit. So I had no problem. I'll just go to Telcel and tell them. I had like $1,000 credit by that time. And so I explained the situation. They're basically saying, well, we can't do anything about it. We don't know that you didn't keep pushing the button. We don't really have any way in our computer to do that. And like, American born and bred, I got assertive. I got confrontational. And the moment I did that, I could see the wall come down. I could see him withdraw. He didn't want anything to do with it anymore. And I had to back up, get a hold of myself, put things back on an even keel. And what we ended up doing was transferring the credit to a plan, which I'm much more happy with anyway. So I'm not saying that by resisting being confrontational, you can always get what you want. But I can tell you, by being confrontational, you're probably not going to get what you want. You're going to get people withdrawing from you. And I have found, taking this attitude back with me in transactions in the United States, it turns out everybody wants to be treated as a person. They don't want to just be treated as your service provider. That person is in the way of you getting what you want. And it works better everywhere. Okay, so the fourth dimension is rules. And this is on a scale from particularist to universalist. So the universalist is a rule-based approach. And it basically says what is good and right to be defined and always applies. So applying the rules universally is the highest principle. A particular culture, far greater attention is given to the obligations of relationships in unique circumstances. So it depends, basically. Okay? Taking care of your own is the highest principle. And if you look at it from that point of view, you can see, well, of course, family and friends, for instance, should get discounts. When I was working at the Monday market, selling some product, as soon as I got to know the tables around me and trying to buy anything from them, I was getting discounts. You know, as soon as I moved into that category of friend or known person, I was getting discounts. I have also heard, and this is a little touchy subject, of like a two-tier pricing system, where a lot of people feel that if you're obviously from an Anglo culture, you walk up in a market, you're going to get a different price. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it's ever happened to me, but it makes sense from that point of view. If you shift over and say, what is more unfair than trying to treat everybody fairly, regardless of their circumstances, charging them all the same prices? You can say, it's really a discount for the people who can't afford it. And I'm fine with that. Another thing is the attitude towards nepotism, towards hiring your relatives. I worked for a company in the United States that was privately held. It was a big company. They had 5 daughters, very traditional family. The 5 daughters all stayed home with the kids, but the sons-in-law all had jobs in the company. And pretty much 4 out of the 5 were known for not doing anything, basically. For just taking advantage of the situation. They weren't going to get fired, and the poor people underneath them had to pick up all the slack. And that's kind of our view of nepotism. Whereas if you're a very family-oriented culture, maybe your view of nepotism is, well, my family is going to do a good job for me. They're my family. You know, they care about me. One thing I was very surprised to hear about was that there's a lot of jobs, I don't know if just government jobs, but certainly government jobs. I have a friend whose his son-in-law's dad works for CFE. And they're waiting for him to retire because then he can pass the job to his son. He can automatically pass the job to his son. I think even some of the teachers who were striking for the right to pass their jobs to their kids. And of course, to somebody that in a completely merit-based culture, that seems like wow. But in a very family-oriented culture, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, the 5th dimension that I'm going to talk about is time. And the two, everybody's going, ha. The two extremes there are a clock-oriented culture and an event time-oriented culture. Okay, so an event time-oriented culture recognizes that events unfold naturally. Okay, how long does it take to do something? As long as it takes. You can't hurry the harvest. You can't make a baby. Thanks. 9 women can't make a baby in 1 month. Okay. I think throughout the vast majority of human history, event time was the way things worked. There were no clocks. Clock time really came into being during the Industrial Revolution when suddenly people were punching time cards. And how many hours you stayed on the job really mattered. You had to be there in time. You couldn't leave before it was time. You had to organize your whole life around that. If your kid was sick, too bad, which we're still dealing with, certainly in the United States. In Mexico, they certainly do adhere to clock time when they know they need to. So if you're a Walmart employee, you know you got to show up on time. But if you're maybe self-employed or you have a little cottage industry, like the little tables out in front of the houses and stuff, you can be a lot more flexible. Things run on event time. 2 of the things in Mexico that I think really illustrate that are the parties, fiestas and siestas, my 2 favorite things about Mexico. The parties build up very slowly. People arrive as they arrive. It really gets going. They last a long time, and usually they go, you know, I've never been able to survive all the way to the end. One of my neighbor's parties. We're always off home. And the siestas, how the stores close, a lot of the stores close here between 3 and 5. And I've been frustrated showing up at 4 going, oh yeah. But I can also understand that. They want those hours to feed their kids, to be with their family, to take a little rest. They're honoring the normal biological rhythms, honoring the fact that it's hot in the middle of the day, and not just trying to ignore that and fight through it. And another one that I really like is I was working with a group of teenage girls, to help them choreograph a dance for one of their quinceañeras. And they were never showing up on time. And I was getting frustrated, and I kept emphasizing, you got to show up on time, please. You're wasting my time. And they're teenagers. It wasn't happening. And so finally I just said, okay, come when you want, but we're ending at 4. Because normally they would come at 3. And if you aren't here by 3:10 and I have something else to do, I'm going to assume you're not coming and I'm going to leave. And it worked out fine. I think one time they did show up and I wasn't there, and they're kind of like, yeah. and they went off home. So that worked out fine. The next one I want to talk about is lifestyle, being versus doing. The best way to illustrate this is the story of the fisherman that probably most of you have heard. I think I heard it first at Open Circle. You've got a fisherman in maybe the lake, and a New York businessman watching him catch fish and going, wow, a lot of fish in that lake. How long do you fish? He goes, about 2 hours a day. That's enough to feed my family and some extra to sell to buy the things I need. Well, what do you do with the rest of your day? Oh, I go and have a drink with some friends. We play guitar, we sing, I play with my kids, hang out. And I said, well, but if you worked all day, you could make so much more money. You could buy more boats. You could employ people. You could start canning the stuff. You could go international. And the guy's listening, okay, and thinking about this. And then what? And the end of the story was, well, then after you're a millionaire, you can retire and move to a little village and fish in the morning, and in the afternoon you can go hang out and have drinks with your friends. And, okay, so they both ended up in the same place. It just took 50 years of work for one guy to get there. Difference between working to live and living to work. The one guy had to define himself by his accomplishments. He didn't feel a sense of worth of just being. Now there's a lot of places around here that teach meditation, mindfulness. You don't really need those. Just look around. You've got some of the best teachers you'll see for being mindful. They truly believe in work-life balance. Relationships have priority. And hanging out with their friends and loved ones is accomplishing something. That's achievement, okay? They find a way to be happy today instead of always looking to the next thing to finally make them happy. So maybe in the United States we have a little too much opportunity because there's always that next thing, that next thing, that next thing. Mexico was recently named by, I think, Happy Planet, I can't remember who, as the second happiest country in the world. And you look at it, there's a lower standard of living, there's the cartel problem, there's a lot of problems going on right now, and yet they just say, what can I make out of this day? Okay, and that has been very, very influential to me. Watching these kids entertaining themselves and not being bored, waiting for the fireworks on the nights of the casino, and they're just hanging out and enjoying it. Okay, so that's being versus doing. Oh, the other thing about fiestas is most of the time, they come in families, they hang out with their own family, they pretty much sit and chat with their family that they would have done during the day anyway. Maybe there's some music and stuff like that, and at the end of it they're going, that was a great party. Because just that, just relaxing and taking in the moment was all they needed. And the last one I want to talk about is risk. It's rated on a scale of high versus low uncertainty avoidance. And here's where I really deviate from what the course said. They said Mexico is, Latin America in general, is a high uncertainty avoidance. But here's the definition. High uncertainty avoidance wants to lower their risk. So they make lots of plans, they make lots of schedules, lots of deadlines, they track to the schedules, and I'm thinking, does that sound like Mexico to me? Not the one that I know. What I see is a lot of people relying on their skill sets. I see houses going up with no plans, and yet they turn out beautiful. Sculpted things on the front wall and beautiful tile work and all of that, done out of skill, rather than out of plans. And I worked in software development. I hated that they were always trying to make us make a project plan. Software development's too complicated. You don't know what's going to come up. But we could never convince them that it was just like, we'll just produce stuff and deliver it a little bit at a time, and we'll see how it goes. I mean, software development is always cost overrun, right? You're always hearing they failed their deadline. So the low uncertainty avoidance takes this attitude of life is what happens when you're making other plans. Or to give the G-rated version, stuff happens. So why spend all that time making plans? Let's do it and see what happens. And in certain aspects, this has been a problem for me because when it comes to things like event planning and trip planning, I'm a warrior. If I'd had a traditional wedding, by the time I got married, I would have been in a little fetal ball, just worrying about if everything was going to turn out all right. And here the attitude is, everything will be fine, and it usually is, okay. But a lot depends on the attitudes of the participants. So they're not they're judging. Oh, people are late. This is not going right. And once again, the fiestas, the weddings, etc. I mean, I've heard some great stories of, you know, the bride showing up 30 minutes late or whatever. And, you know, it's like, well, let's have the wedding, you know. So getting back to the quinceañera dance, while we were doing it, I was doing my normal fretting and fussing. The girls, you know, 3 would show up one day, a different 3 would show up the other day. I had no idea whether we were going to get it all together. Just starting to rain, so good timing. I had no idea whether we were going to get it all together. They didn't seem particularly worried. Comes the day of the quince, and they all put on little outfits, and we were in the place behind El Jardín, big stage. They get up on the stage, and they go through the dance. They actually did really well. At the end, the one in the lead flubbed up. Everybody kind of covers her error. But regardless, I don't think it would matter what they would have done. The crowd is screaming and cheering and loving it and having a great time. And that was really a huge lesson to me about just, you know, back off, quit worrying so much, let it happen. Okay, so those are, you know, my experiences. I'd be happy during the discussion to hear about if you've had similar or different experiences. I want to end up on a Mark Twain quote. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people sorely needed on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. But I would add that you have to approach that travel with a bit of cultural intelligence. Let it soften your heart, let it expand your mind. Thank you.
You know, usually I would say, don't make any comments. I don't want to hear a damn thing you have to say about anything but a question. Today we'll take your comments, but they need to be brief, because the more access we have to the more people, the more we'll learn, right? So keep your comments very brief, or I will do a cut-in in some appropriate or inappropriate way.
May I say that the rain has come in, so if you people in the center would move your chairs to the center to get some people out of the rain, and feel free to come back here and stand back here if you need to, okay? Don't go away, just move.
Yeah, close up the aisle.
Yeah, yeah, right. It's a little rain.
It's a little rain. Relax. Settle in. Yeah, you can, you know, this is only going to be for a few minutes. If you need to, you can stand underneath. Somewhere.
Always the gazebo.
There's the gazebo. Tons of room there.
I have a comment. Yesterday I was sitting next to a friend. Who commented that his neighbor, this is a very small condominium, his neighbor managed to get the condominium gardener fired because the Mexican gardener was spending too much time leaning on his hoe talking to the neighbors. The same thing is true in my condominium, where some gringos are complaining they see the gardeners not working. My friend's comment was, this lady does not realize that work is a social activity.
Yeah. And if the garden's pretty, what difference does it make?
Who else would like to say something?
That one back here?
Okay. You can stand up, please.
I can't, I'm sorry, I'm a walking stick today. Sans, I love the talk, know you quite well. Where, for me, one of the biggest interesting things that happened when I came to Mexico was the reduction in personal space. It doesn't seem to exist. Do you think that's belonged to the community-based part of the family?
Yeah, usually the collectivist cultures have much smaller personal space. But for you, that shouldn't be a problem, because you're kind of a... Yeah.
Along these lines, a kind of interesting book is by Rick Steves called Travel as a Political Act, meaning if we go to other countries, we might notice that there are other ways of doing things other than ours, and they might even be better.
Thank you for that recommendation. Who else? Right here?
What's your opinion on having to really understand the culture? You have to really be able to speak the language. Do you think that's, what's your thought on that?
I think it's very much worth making an effort to speak the language, but I know when I speak the language, what's going on in my head, what I mean is not always what they're hearing, because the subtleties of a language are very, very difficult. But I think more understanding what's underlying everything, those underlying things I think is more important.
Who else? Yeah? No? We're good. Oh, up in the gazebo.
All the way up there.
All the way up there, sitting all the way up there.
I want to share the practice of platicando, which I found very nourishing. Just talking, to spend some time just chatting without a purpose, not trying to accomplish anything. And I found, when I meet someone who I just intuitively like, I can go hang out for 20 minutes and talk about nothing and just pass the time, and all of a sudden I feel better. And so that's a Mexican custom that I enjoy very much.
Or even not talking at all. Just
Platicando.
being in the company.
Say that again?
Platicando.
Chatting, basically.
Platicar.
Chismoreando is the other word.
What's that?
In Spanish, we have a saying that is said, chismorrear. Chisme is gossip. Chismorrear is another word that's used for platicando. It's more personal, sort of.
Anybody else?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
I love your speech. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to say about teachers that we hear now that they have these problems because they want to pass their position to their children. Well, the main problem is not that they pass it to their children and that's it, because the problem is they are not teachers. The next generation, they are not teachers. That's the main problem. So we have the dad who is a teacher and has been a teacher for 20 years, 25, 30, I don't know. And then comes the daughter or the son, and they want to inherit that position, but they haven't studied. So that is the main problem. I just wanted to comment.
Thank you. Anybody else? Well, thank you all for coming to Open Circle. Hope to see you next week. Given the rain in particular, will you please help us with stacking the chairs, pick up your coffee cups? You can turn on your cell phone. Thank you all.